Welcome back, students. This is Module 6.2.3, Biodiversity. We're going to start off, and remember this is in the context of the human population explosion which has taken place. We're going to start off by talking about three different forms of wealth. The first form of wealth is material wealth, and this is what you think of as wealth. This is money, property, material that's worth stuff, great works of art, things and commodities. Think of bling bling. A second form of wealth that's not nearly as appreciated is cultural wealth. Cultural wealth for a long time was actually warred against. When one group of people overcame another one in a warfare kind of scenario, they would obliterate the culture of the loser. In a modern society, however, we embrace cultural diversity, especially at universities and colleges. Of course, cultural wealth translates to the language, the art, the music, the technology of a particular group of people that have stayed together through history, the food. So all these kinds of things are cultural wealth. The third form of wealth is called biological wealth. And this is the form of wealth that I would say is the most underappreciated. You can think of biological wealth as biodiversity. At its very simplest, you can think of it as a number of unique species. So the first two forms of wealth are valued, but the third form is greatly undervalued. And this is important because we are right now in the midst of what has been called the sixth great extinction. This is a loss of biological diversity, a loss of biological wealth that is occurring right now. As I speak to you, species are disappearing from the planet. And so it's occurring now. It is anthropogenic, which means that it's caused by humans. And so here's a little comic that's not funny. The bear says, I think these humans are a big threat to us. And the bluebird says, yeah, a lot of us are already extinct. And the little, I guess, gray fox says, and the habitats we live in. And that's really pretty much the score. The humans are a big threat, and they're causing this sixth great extinction. So don't forget that. The sixth great extinction is being caused by the unparalleled growth in one species, humans, who are numerically very, very successful. To put this sixth great extinction into perspective, let's look at this figure. This actually shows some of the great mass extinction events of the past. And if you look at this figure, right to left is time, and the bar width represents the number of living families. And this is a percentage of animal families that became extinct. And so right here, we're at about 440 million years ago, we saw our first mass extinction in which about half of the animal families became extinct. And before the width had recovered, you can see, and this is taking millions of years before it had fully recovered, then there was another extinction event just a little bit more than 355 million years ago. And that wiped out 30% of the families. And if we continue along, and there was a long stretch here of recovery, and the width got the biological diversity is correlated with the width, and it got pretty wide, but then we saw this huge extinction event at 250 million years ago, in which 60% of animal families disappeared from the face of the earth. And we can see that even though we had a fairly rapid increase in biological diversity, again, another event, 35%. 65 million years ago, this is kind of an auspicious date. This is when the dinosaurs became extinct. And at that time, about half of the animal families became extinct. And so this gives us an idea, and we can count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So those are the 5 previous great extinctions or mass extinctions. And I want you to notice a couple facts about these extinctions. The sixth great extinction is going to occur over here, and it's going to cause this width to greatly constrict as we lose species. But here's the fact that's really important to consider in the context of humans and biodiversity, is that each mass extinction required more than 20 million years to recover its former level of biodiversity. Modern humans have existed for about 200,000 years. And so what we're talking about is a time period that's really much greater than our species has existed for the Earth to recover its former level of biological diversity. And just because you get the same number of species, a species that's gone, it's gone forever. You don't get that species back. There are other species. Anyway, we were talking about the mass extinction event at 65 million years ago. And most of the extinction events, the 5 previous ones, are believed to have occurred because of a change in climate. 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs became extinct when a meteor collided with the Earth and causing some climate change. It's believed that the meteorite, when it struck, vaporized, and this caused some climatic shifts, which led to a series of events that caused the demise of the dinosaurs and provided an opportunity for mammals to become more biologically diverse. Well, one thing that we know for sure is that the 6th great extinction caused by humans, because humans aren't going anywhere, this 6th great extinction is going to occur. What we don't know is how big it's going to be. How can we estimate what we're going to lose? There are less than 2 million described species. A described species is one that has a scientific name and there's a specimen in a museum in a description. There are many, many undescribed species. The biological diversity of the world has been estimated conservatively to consist of at least 10 to 30 million species. It's almost certain that there's 10 million species. And the entomologists, those that study insects in the rainforest, they're the ones that give us the high numbers, the high end, because they find new species every time they go out. And the rainforests, in fact, do contain over half of the world's species. In part, this is because it has served as a refuge. As the ice ages have occurred through the history of the Earth, the tropical region hasn't frozen, and so all of its species have been able to maintain themselves. The area of all the rainforests, tropical rainforests of the world, are similar to the area of the lower 48 states, and we lose an area about half the size of Florida each year. So again, let's address the question, how can we estimate our losses? Well, one technique is to use a species area curve to estimate species loss from habitat destruction. This was a concept, the species area curve, a technique that was developed in island biogeography. Island biogeography was used to study islands and their biological diversity and the distribution of life on islands, and how islands are colonized and how species become extinct on islands. And so what they did was they examined the number of species supported by islands of different sizes, and they quantified a relationship between the size of an island and the number of species it can support. Now, you might be saying, islands, so Mr. Charles, what does this have to do with what we're studying? Well, we're talking about islands of habitat. So we can have some habitat surrounded by agricultural land, or some habitat surrounded by urban lands, and this will give us an idea, because humans are increasing agricultural lands and urban lands all the time. And so here's an example of a species area curve from island biogeography. This is from the Caribbean. As we get up here over to the right, this is a larger island size, and this is a species diversity index. This is not the number of species or anything, but this is an index which is correlated with biological diversity, and we can see that as islands are larger, that there are more species. You can probably recognize Jamaica and Cuba, Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. Some of the smaller ones you may or may not recognize. But here's another manifestation of a species area curve. This is the number of plant species, and this is the area, or the size of the island. and we can see that there's this linear relationship. By looking at the slope of this line, it helps us to quantify that. So this is a concept of a habitat island. I believe this is from Great Britain. On the left is an aerial photograph, and on the right we actually have it keyed as to what is there. You can see that the yellow that surrounds all this is in fact agricultural land, and we can see just a little bit of forest here, an oak and conifer and broadleaf forest, kind of in the shape of a T, really, but kind of lets us see kind of the state of nature in England, for example. Here are some habitat islands from the tropics. You can see that they've been cut. These have been intentionally left. This is part of a study. I think maybe it's the Smithsonian, I believe, that's doing this, but they have islands of different sizes. And you can see rainforests out there, but this clearing and this loss of habitat is usually not so dramatic as this, but nevertheless, that's what we're talking about. And here is the relationship. You should remember this quantification or this relationship. A 90% decrease in habitat area in island size produces a 50% loss of species. If we say that same relationship the other way, 10% of the habitat can support half of the species, but it's not going to be the nice half of the species. It's going to be the tough, resilient species, the cockroaches and the rats and the mice. In any case, we can apply this relationship to islands of habitat. When humans change the land use, remember there's 7 billion of us now, and of course the organisms that live there have nowhere to go. And given only habitat loss, it is expected that the extinction rate will be 100 to 1,000 times greater than the background extinction rate. So what scientists did was they calculated how rapidly species became extinct by looking at the fossil record, and the estimate is that in the 6th great extinction, just from habitat loss, the extinction rate will be 100 to 1,000 times greater. And so that is a sobering thought indeed. And I want to make an analogy for you. I want you to consider, in here, I'm going to draw a picture down here at the bottom. I hope that you be able to view this okay. But I'm going to draw, it's a pretty simple picture. I'm going to draw, this is a sink, not a very nice sink, and there's a liquid level in it. There's a drain here in the bottom that comes out, and there's something dripping, and there's a faucet that supplies this sink. And so the faucet is speciation. This is how new species are formed. The level of the water in the sink is biodiversity. And you can probably guess that the drain is extinction, the loss of species. Now, extinction is a natural process, but in the 6th great extinction, humans have stepped in to greatly accelerate it. So humans have 2 major impacts. They increase the rate of extinction, and they slow speciation. Therefore, they cause the loss of biodiversity. And so this is a very important analogy, and it is just an analogy. Here we talk about the sink analogy right here, and so you can kind of compare this to that little scratchy drawing I made. But that's the key point right there, is that human disturbance slows speciation and speeds extinction. One thing I will say about the sink analogy is that over time we've talked about all these mass extinctions. So far more species have gone down that drain, have become extinct than currently occupy the earth, even though we think there's millions of species. But just think of that. Think of things like trilobites that no longer occur, and there were many, many species of trilobites, and we don't have them anymore. But here is kind of the downward spiral of extinction. Through human intervention, we can cause a population of natural species to be small. This causes inbreeding and can lead to genetic drift. These two lead to loss of genetic variability. This reduces the fitness of the individual, and it reduces the ability of the population to adapt. This leads to lower reproduction and higher mortality. It leads to a smaller population, and you can see it's a downward spiral that occurs again and again. And inbreeding is a tough one in a small population. Okay, the current extinction rate is believed to be about 1,000 times the background rate. As I say, 100 to 1,000. 1,000 might be a little high, but it's certainly at least 100 times the background rate. And here we go. 34% of all fishes, 51% of freshwater fishes, 25% of amphibians, 25% of mammals, 20% of reptiles, 11% of birds, 14% of plants are under the threat of extinction. And these numbers are only going to get worse. And so we're going to continue this, but we're going to end this module here, and we'll continue with the next module in which we do part 2 of biodiversity, and we'll talk about threats to biodiversity and give some examples of some losses that have been suffered. With that, we'll end this module.